Good morning. I'm Cynthia Cochran-Carney, the pastor at First Presbyterian Church of San Rafael. We continue to have worship, and I am preaching from my home in the season of the COVID-19 pandemic and sheltering in place. So let us open ourselves to the Spirit's movement and truth for us. Our first reading this morning comes from the prophet Isaiah from the Hebrew Scriptures, chapter 42. The prophet Isaiah is speaking on behalf of Yahweh, of God. Isaiah 42, beginning in verse 14. For a long time I have kept silent. I have been quiet and held myself back. But now, like a woman in childbirth, I cry out and gasp and pant. I will lay waste the mountains and hills and dry up all their vegetation. I will turn rivers into islands and dry up the pools. I will lead the blind by ways they have not known. Along unfamiliar paths I will guide them. I will turn the darkness into light and make the rough places smooth. These are the things I will do. I will not forsake them. Our first reading from the New Testament comes from John's Gospel, chapter 16, beginning in verse 19. Jesus saw what his disciples wanted to ask him about this, so he said to them, "Are you asking one another what I meant when I said, 'In a little while you will see me no more, and then after a little while you will see me'? Very truly I tell you, you will weep and mourn while the world rejoices. You will grieve, but your grief will turn to joy. A woman giving birth to a child has pain because her time has come. But when her baby is born, she forgets the anguish because of her joy that a child is born into the world. So with you, now is your time of grief, but I will see you again, and you will rejoice, and no one will take away your joy." And finally, a verse from Matthew, chapter 23, verse 37, Jesus speaking to his followers. Jesus said, "Jerusalem, Jerusalem, you who kill the prophets and stone those sent to you. How often I have longed to gather your children together, as a hen gathers her chicks under her wings, and you were not willing." Let us take time now for a moment of prayer, and we will begin with a time of silence. Holy One, we hear your ancient words. May we hear your truth for us. May we be open that we might be transformed. Amen. We are living in an in-between time as we live in the midst of this COVID-19 pandemic. In the Bay Area here, in San Francisco Bay Area and Marin County, we have been staying home with a shelter-in-place order for almost 8 weeks now. And there is starting to be a shift with some businesses and places opening. And we're wondering, how is it going to be when we are out? How will we know it is safe? What and who do we trust? When will we know we can open the church building and worship together, sing together, study together, serve together? Last week I preached on Jesus as the gate of the sheepfold in the threshold. And I described that space at the entry as a liminal space. That's one way I've been thinking about this season of being sheltering in place and facing this pandemic, that we are in a liminal time. One of my favorite writers and spiritual leaders, Richard Rohr, wrote a series of reflections on this theme of liminal space last week, and I want to share a little bit about what he said. Rohr wrote, "Liminal space is an inner state and sometimes an outer situation where we can begin to think and act in new ways. It is where we are betwixt and between, having left one room or stage of life, but not having entered the next. We usually enter liminal space when our former way of being is challenged or changed. Perhaps we lose a job or a loved one. It might be during an illness or at the birth of a child or a major relocation. It is a graced time, but often it doesn't feel graced in any way. In such a space, we are not certain or in control. And this global pandemic that we now face is an example of an immense collective liminal space." He goes on to write, "The very vulnerability and openness of liminal space allows room for something genuinely new to happen. Liminal space is where we are most teachable, often because we are most humbled. It's no surprise then that we generally avoid liminal space. But much of the work of authentic spirituality and human development is to get people into liminal space and keep them there long enough that they can learn something essential and new. It invites us to discover and live from a broader perspective with a much deeper seeing." Finally, he writes, "In liminal space, we sometimes need the not do and the not perform according to our usual successful patterns. We need to be silent instead of speaking, experience emptiness instead of fullness. It would be difficult to exist in this time of the global crisis and not feel caught between two worlds, the one we knew and the one that is to come. Our consciousness and that of future generations has been changed." This is a liminal season for the world, for our country, for our community, for our church. Many of our conversations of the congregation and those involved in the life of our faith community on Zoom lately has reflected this wondering about how this time is changing us and what new priorities and behaviors and connections and spiritual discernment can come from this time if we are open and paying attention. On this Mother's Day, I want to share with you about a time in my life, a liminal time, and how it deepened and broadened my experience of God, the divine presence, in my life and ministry. It is a more personal story than I usually share in my sermons. In July 1994, there was good news and there was bad news. First, the good news came. As my husband Jeffrey and I listened to the radiologist describe what he saw on the ultrasound, we saw pictures of this amazing being inside of me. Its skull and body and limbs were all growing well. It was moving around in the comfort of that warm liquid. But then the shocking news came. There was a second baby. Twins. How could this be? We had no idea. As the doctor described what he saw, we soon realized something was very wrong. The second baby was very sick and could not survive outside the womb. And if the sick baby's heart stopped, the healthy baby was in jeopardy. We lived with this reality for the next 4.5 months of my first pregnancy. All pregnancies are liminal seasons. Mine had an added dimension. And we lived with this paradox of life and death inside me, this tension, this contradiction. And each day, then and since then, I think a lot about paradoxes and how things are within tension of each other. And as I have reflected on my experience over the years, I see even more paradoxes and liminal seasons and spaces in my life and ministry and in the world. We all live with different kinds of tensions, of life and death, hope and despair, joy and grief. We can feel both at the same time, holding both at the same time. We feel them now in this time of sheltering in place, when we feel both grateful for shelter and food and connections. Some of us may be very stressed about some of those things. Will they continue to be in place? And we feel grief for all the suffering that is happening in our community and country and around the world as people get sick. Many people die from this virus. So we're holding all of this in tension. During my paradoxical pregnancy, I prayed to God to give me strength and patience every day. I don't know that I have ever counted on my faith and my relationship with the Holy One so deeply, just day to day, to face each day as I did during those months. The process of giving birth to new life is long and painful and full of anticipation and hope, all of it wrapped up together. There are many biblical images of God as the one who creates. God created the universe and the earth and you and me and Mount Tamalpais and the Pacific Ocean and all the creatures who live there. The creating God of the Bible is often described as a woman giving birth and as a mother. Isaiah 42 offers an image of God experiencing labor pains. The prophet was writing to the people of Israel who felt caught in a paradox of their own. They were God's chosen people, God's covenant people. And yet now they were in exile in Babylon. Jerusalem and Judah, their homelands, had been defeated and captured by the Babylonians, and now they were in a strange land. How could they be both God's chosen people and yet feel abandoned by God? The prophet reminded them that although God had allowed them to go into exile because they had not acted with justice and compassion, there would be a time when God would redeem the people and bring them home. The prophet writes the words of Yahweh, "I cry out like a woman in labor. I gasp and pant." God's anguish at human failure to embody justice is captured in this image of a woman in the throes of labor, unable to catch her breath in the pain. And yet the result of this birth will be joy. The prophet uses images of hope and transformation, darkness into light, rough places made smooth. So the prophet reflects this paradox of motherhood, the pain of giving birth, of knowing your offspring will experience pain, and yet the joy of bringing new life into the world. There are other places in the Bible where God is depicted as a pregnant woman or a woman giving birth. In Deuteronomy, we read, "You were unmindful of the rock that bore you. You forgot that God who gave you birth." The Psalms have quite a few images, and one is interesting that we miss in the English translation. There's a Hebrew word, rakum, and it's usually translated as compassion or steadfast love. It's closely related to another Hebrew word, rakam, which means womb. So God's compassion is womb-like love, protection, care, safety, holding. So we could translate Psalm 103 as the Lord is merciful and gracious, slow to anger, and abounding in steadfast, womb-like love. Another passage from Isaiah focuses on God's comfort specifically. Ancient Israel saw itself as a people liberated and comforted by God. The first and foundational liberation was from slavery in Egypt. The second liberation was from the Babylonian exile. In Isaiah 66, there comes an end of the time of exile. It was probably written during the period after 538 BC, the year in which Cyrus allowed some of the people of Israel to leave Babylon and return to Jerusalem. The returnees, who had expected this glorious restoration as envisioned by the prophets, found themselves going back and facing many hardships. So one of the images the prophet offers is this, the image of Yahweh as a mother in Isaiah 66:13. As a mother comforts her child, so I will comfort you. You shall be comforted in Jerusalem. How does God comfort as a mother? In her book, Reimagining God, Hebrew Bible professor Johanna Boss explores some of the biblical images of God. And when she analyzes and looks at this passage from Isaiah 66, she shares this story from her own life. She wrote, "I remember my own mother as not particularly comforting. I remember sharply, however, one thing my mother did that I identified with comfort. On my long bicycle trip back from the high school, it was often dark in the wintry afternoons in the Netherlands. The ride home always seemed long when doing it alone. It could be boring or dreary. And when it became dark, I was sometimes afraid. It was cold, too, the weather being often extremely inclement. There was little traffic on the long, poplar-lined road that took me home, some cyclists, a few cars. And then far off, I would see a bike's headlamp, and I would wonder who else was on the road, hoping it was my mother, who sometimes rode out to meet me part way. On coming closer, she would call out, 'Is it you?' It was then, at those moments, nothing so comforting as my mother's presence, a presence that spelled home for me." So she concludes, I imagine God's motherly comfort intended for the community ancient Israel. So it is intended for the human community that is covenanted to the God of Israel today. God's motherly comfort is essentially a presence that is our home. In the New Testament, Jesus uses images of birth, of being born, of water and spirit. In John 3, he has a conversation with Nicodemus about being born again and again. In Matthew, Jesus laments over Jerusalem for the ways the people with power could not accept love and compassion that were coming in as the reign of God for all people. So Jesus describes himself as a mother hen who shelters and protects and loves her chicks. When he is predicting his death in John chapter 16, Jesus describes how his suffering on the cross were like birth pangs of bringing forth the reign of God. Where do you see the Holy One giving birth to new life in people's lives and communities in this season of the pandemic? In this liminal season, what is an aspect of your life that the Holy One might be giving birth to? What is shifting? What might be different? Is it a deeper knowing, a new way of seeing, a deeper commitment? Things shift in our liminal seasons and give birth to even small things that are new. My pregnancy was difficult for Jeffrey and me on a day-to-day basis. I was scared. I was hopeful. I often felt I didn't know what to do next. I kept thinking about how to let go of that because I couldn't control it, but I tried to be hopeful and prayerful and open. Jackson needed Jacob to keep on living, to maintain his heartbeat, so Jackson, the healthy baby, could continue to live and grow. In the midst of all of that difficult time, there were times I really had a deeper awareness of some truths that I was learning. I learned in a deeper way that we are all interdependent. God created us to live as if our life depended on the lives of our sisters and brothers and are connected to the health and well-being of each other. That is the essence of the great commandment. Love our neighbor as ourselves. Our whole life is valuable, and we are called to live in ways to show that God's love is for each person and every person. Jacob and Jackson reminded me that life is both fragile and yet has great tenacity and strength. The doctors were not sure how long Jacob would continue to have a heartbeat, so I had weekly checks. They were not sure if he would be born alive. He was. In many ways, he was in worse physical condition than they had expected. And yet he did live until delivery and for 80 minutes after that. In many ways, he gave his brother life. Our son Jackson is now 25 years old and healthy and enjoying his life. So I remember that life is fragile and strong. We see this today in our pandemic world. Life is fragile. And those who were on ventilators, some do survive, and it took great strength. Life has great tenacity. And finally, as people who follow the ways of Jesus, the Beloved calls us to be people of hope and transformation. To believe and trust that love is more powerful than hate, that death and evil do not have the last word, that our lives are measured by compassion and character and not by money or status or things. In this liminal season, may we find our spiritual resilience in the Holy One. Spiritual resilience that is both tough and strong, and at the same time flexible and able to let go. The Divine Mother invites us to that dance. May it be so. Amen.